Thank you. Before I get started, I just want to do a brief introduction of Mr. Schlesinger and his amazing career, so you guys are all aware of all of the amazing things he's done. Music attorney Al Schlesinger has over 6 decades of experience in the music industry. His roster of clients includes music legends like the Beach Boys, The Doors, Tina Turner, T-Bone Burnett, Will Jennings, and Melissa Etheridge. Al was the personal manager for the band Bread throughout their 10-year career, and he was also named Billboard Magazine's Entertainment Attorney of the Year in 1976. As if all of that wasn't enough, he acted as the president of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences from 1987 to 1989, and served for 2 terms as national chairman of their board. Please join me in welcoming Attorney Al Schlesinger. Al, to get started, I wanted to kind of set the tone and help everyone understand just how much history you've experienced. So to begin, I want to let everyone know Al was born in 1927. So can you tell us a little bit about what was just going on in the world in 1927 to give?
I don't remember it too well, but I've read the history books, and I know that Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis airplane in 1927, landed in Paris, and also the great musical by Jerome Kern, Oscar Hammerstein II, Showboat, opened in 1927, still going strong, I might add.
Excellent. Thank you. What was the first album you ever purchased?
Oh my. When I first became interested in music, there was no such thing as an album. It was all singles. There were no soundtrack albums except for original cast recordings, classical works, operas, but no individual artists. So let me see, it would have had to have been in the 1950s in all probability. By that time, I was getting all my albums free.
Lucky.
No, I enjoyed the big bands, people like Glenn Miller, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Harry James, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey. I don't know how many of those names you might know, but they were the stars of the late 30s, 40s, early 50s, and they made wonderful music. The other music I enjoyed and probably would have bought albums would be the Broadway musical Oklahoma, Carousel, Music Man, Sound of Music, Most Happy Fella, and many others, and as well as the Hollywood musical, the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies, Judy Garland, Deanna Durbin, Bobby Breen. Those were some of the Shirley Temple, some of the stars. If they had albums out, I probably would have bought.
Okay, thank you. As you know, everyone here at Full Sail University is studying entertainment in some way. What was your major in college?
My major in college, I had 2. I went to CCNY in New York and majored in foreign trade, and then I went to the University of Minnesota for a couple of years and majored in international relations.
Interesting. So when you went to college, did you intend on entering the music industry, or was that not something on your radar yet?
It was a dream, but it really wasn't on the radar screen. My father wanted me to go to work for a major corporation and work my way up, which I tried my hand at, and I didn't work my way anyplace except out of the business, and then pursued my dream of getting into the music business.
Can you tell us a little bit about that step when you entered into the music industry and what that was like?
Well, the reason that I went to work for a corporation, it was General Electric, by the way, was because of the fact that my family had moved from New York to California while I was in service. And the city they moved to was Los Angeles, and that was really the boondocks. And they had one-man offices, and there wasn't much music business in Los Angeles. Everything was in New York. And after about a year and a half at General Electric, a position opened for me with a small record company and publishing company. After a few years, I became a partner. A few more years, I bought out my partner, and then studied for the law and became an attorney.
Okay. I have a couple questions for those in-between steps.
Okay.
So, working in the publishing world, who was the first artist that you worked with as a publisher or a label?
Oh my. Probably a gentleman named Don Robertson, who was a songwriter, an artist. He had one hit in the 50s called The Happy Whistler as an artist, and he had a number of hits called I Really Don't Want to Know, which was a big country standard, and several other pop standards. He was quite popular.
Okay. And when you worked, you owned the record label, were there skills that you felt were missing that caused you to go to law school? What drove you to the law?
Well, it's a bit of a story. I realized that the little guys were going to be bought up by the big guys, and that I was going to be out of business sooner than later. I wasn't sufficiently intellectually stimulated by the music business. I joined an organization called the California Copyright Conference, still in operation today, where they had speakers from film, attorneys from the film and television world. There were no music attorneys because the industry was too small, but I admired them secretly, and then I managed to have a #1 hit with an R&B song called Hearts of Stone, and had legal problems with that. I couldn't find an attorney, and the combination of all of those factors led me one day to decide I want to be an attorney, and I pursued it. I ran my music business during the day and went to law school primarily at night, and graduated and became an attorney in 1959 when I was only 3 years old.
I'm going to call you out a little bit here. So, because you were sworn in 1959, you've now been practicing for 54 years.
This is true.
So to understand, 54 years is a very long time. I don't know a single attorney that is still practicing actively every single day.
Well, I have to practice because I haven't gotten it right yet.
Well, what keeps you going? I mean, did you ever think, well, maybe I'll retire? I mean, what makes you want to keep practicing?
Loving what I do. I love being a music attorney. I can't imagine being anything else but a music attorney.
That's wonderful. I'm going to take you into a couple of the artists that you represented. So first, I'd like to start with the Beach Boys, who are pictured here. Can you tell me what it was like to work with such a nationally recognized group?
Well, it was quite wonderful. I had some fairly prestigious clients, but no one who had reached the heights like the Beach Boys. And I dealt mostly with Brian Wilson. The band was three brothers, Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, a cousin, Michael Love, and a neighbor, Alan Jardine. And they were managed by the Wilson brothers' father, Murray Wilson. And I had most of my meetings with Brian Wilson and his father was along for many of them. And it was interesting and exciting because as their fame and popularity grew, there were more and more deals to negotiate.
So on that same vein, I'm going to just show some more pictures of the incredibly famous acts that you helped and represented throughout your career. Tina Turner, Melissa Etheridge at the peak of her career. Mm-hmm. What's the difference when you're representing an artist like this that's at the peak of their career versus maybe a lesser known artist? Do you have to change how you represent them or how you advise them?
Yes, because of the fact that you have to be realistic. I can be negotiating with RCA Records for two different artists, one beginning, one famous, and I'm aware enough to realize that the contracts are going to be totally different and that I can get something for the established artist that I can't get for the newer artist, and so I will treat them and the negotiations differently because of the difference of the people who I'm representing.
And I've heard you in the past talk a little bit about the fact that 360 deals are relatively new in the music industry. It wasn't something that was around 30, 40 years ago.
That's correct.
Can you talk about, a lot of artists really feel that 360 deals are a terrible thing and they damage, they're completely one-sided for the label. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it might be a good thing and what artists should do when faced with that sort of contract?
Sure. I represent more creative people, and my sympathies are with the creators, the songwriters, the artists, the producers, the engineers. But in fairness, looking at the business from strictly a business perspective, the artists have had a very, very good run all these years because of the fact that they put up no money. The record company pays for everything. When they sign an artist, usually they will do an album which can run well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'll make videos on the first 2 or 3 singles which can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'll give some tour support, and they put out the money, all of the money. They have by contract, the right to recoup it out of future royalties, but if, let's say, the artist doesn't sell their first record, the record company can eat $1 million very, very easily. So they take 100% of the risk. Also, traditionally, and still goes on to some degree today, the record is everything. You don't make it big in the business, or you haven't been able to make it big in the business without records. And again, the record company not only pays for everything, but they do all the manufacturing of records, the marketing, sales, promotion, and so they take all the risk. At the end of the contract, or if the record company doesn't exercise an option for additional albums, the artist walks away. They have they owe the record company nothing, and the record company, again, may have lost in the high 6 or the low 7 figures. So that's the record side of it. And what happens is, when an artist has a career in the music business, in the vast majority of cases, it's because of having become a big record seller. And then they go on to sell, to have concerts, make a lot of money in concerts, sell merchandise at concerts, have all kinds of deals in television and in film, and they own their own publishing company or publishing companies, and the record company, until the 360 deal, participated in nothing. They took all the risk, were responsible for the artist becoming a successful artist through the marketing of their records, and then the artist would say goodbye, and the record company was left with the records that they owned and would have some kind of a catalog of those records, but they really didn't share in the subsequent success of the record artist. And that was the way the business ran until the piracy on the internet and millions of people getting their records for nothing. And until a court decision against Napster, basically every recording made up through that time was available, and it was for, anybody could have it for free. And the record company started to lose money, and they had to look for ways to somehow change that equation a little bit, and thus the 360 deal. In my opinion, it doesn't really work because of the fact that if the artist doesn't become successful, there's no money there for the record company. Once they do become successful, the dynamics between the record company and the artist change. When you're a new artist, the record company calls the shots. They have all the negotiating strength, and the first contract that a new artist signs, unless there's a bidding war for their services by multiple record companies, which is rare, the record company calls all the shots. The artist starts to sell records in quantity in the hundreds of thousands or the millions, and at some point in time, their attorney will say to the record company, it's time to renegotiate. And not once in my career, which spans a number of years, I probably renegotiated hundreds of contracts. Not once did a record company ever say, read your contract. We're not going to renegotiate. They're always prepared to renegotiate. They might say it's a little too soon, let's see what the next album does, but they'll all renegotiate. And in the renegotiation, trust me, every artist who's having any kind of major success is saying to the record company, that 360 part of the contract, that's out of there. Whether it's in the contract or not, it has to be deleted. And so that when the artist really makes money, the record company's not going to enjoy it anyhow, because the artist will have renegotiated their contract, and that part of the contract will be deleted from the contract.
So should an artist, when they are presented with a situation where they might have to sign one of these deals, is that the point where they need to get an attorney? Or can they go ahead and enter the 360 and then get it when they think it's time to renegotiate?
Well, the best time for an artist to get an attorney is the earliest time that they can afford one. Very often, their first professional contract is with a personal manager or an agent, and they need an attorney to negotiate those. And so that also the music attorney is somewhat unique, like the film attorney or a TV attorney or a book publishing attorney. They not only know the law and they know what their job is, they also know the people in the business, they know the organizations, and they can really direct an artist. It's very worthwhile for a new artist who doesn't know the ins and outs of the music business to actually get an attorney as soon as they're able to afford one, and they can always work out some kind of an arrangement where they can afford it.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the legal stuff in a little bit, but I want to go back into your history again.
Okay.
I'm going to show a picture here of Jack Holzman.
Okay.
Do you recognize this man?
Yeah, he resembles Jack Holtzman. Yes.
Can you tell me when you came to know him?
Yes. It was 1967, and I undertook the representation of a band. The leader was Arthur Lee, and the band was Love. At some point, it became known as Arthur Lee and Love, but I had met Jack and knew him casually, and I realized, knowing his artist roster, that he didn't have any kind of a rock band, and rock was the thing at the time. And I contacted him, and he fell in love with the music, and we negotiated our first deal together. I subsequently negotiated the contract for Bread and the Doors with Jack Colesman, who was a wonderful man, very reasonable, and didn't come up with the usual cliches and things of that kind. If he thought something was reasonable, he would say, yeah, we'll do that. And he had an attorney who I ultimately negotiated with, but the guts of the deal I always did with Jack.
Okay.
Wonderful man, and we're friendly to this day.
Excellent. Now, he started Elektra Records out of his dorm room, I read. So did you, when you were dealing with him, did you feel like he knew what he was doing? I assume by the time you got to him, he was a little bit more established.
Oh, he was more established. He started the record company in the early to mid-'50s. Mm-hmm. And his artists were special artists. He had the woman whose name eludes me at the moment. I know it very well. And if I keep talking long enough, maybe for a few hours, it'll come to me. But she was a folk singer. She won a Grammy for Send in the Clouds. Who am I talking about? Anybody here know the name? Okay. And he had another one who became an actor and a Broadway star, whose name also eludes me. He starred in Fiddler on the Roof, and not Zero Mostel. But anyhow, he was dealing primarily with folk singers, okay, Broadway, and straight-ahead pop. It was 12, 13 years later that I negotiated my first deal with him.
Okay. And so you said that you negotiated the contract with Elektra Records and Bread, correct?
That's correct.
And with Bread, you acted as their manager.
That is correct.
So you were already an attorney.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden you decided to jump into this management role.
Right. I never ceased being an attorney, just that being Bread's manager probably took up about a third of my time.
What made you decide that you wanted to do management as well as act as an attorney for a group?
Well, I had a fellow attorney friend of mine who was managing an act, a jazz act, and I asked him, and he said, do it. And the day after they asked me to be their manager, I had a meeting with an agent. And after we were through with our business, I told him that this band wanted me to manage them. What did he think? He said, do it. I said, why do you say that? He says, well, I deal with people who own dry cleaning businesses and auto mechanics. He says, they don't know nothing about the business. You know the business. You can deal with the record company and people in the business. He said, and I think it would be a great idea for you to do. And I gave it some thought, and I realized that touring as an important part of the business was still relatively new. And I didn't know too much about venues and concert promoters or merchandise and things of that kind. I didn't know too much about dealing with agents on lengthy tours and things of that kind. And I figured, gee, that would be great training for me. I would be a better attorney as a result. And it happened to work. They were a wonderful band, and they had hit after hit after hit. And I got involved with every aspect of the music business.
So you managed them for 10 years?
That's correct, from inception to breakup. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. What, in your opinion, then, makes a good manager?
A good manager is somebody who hopefully is creative and has ideas Over the years, I can think of 3 managers who did things that broke their acts wide open, and it was their creativity. There was a band called Grand Funk Railroad. Has anybody here heard the name Grand Funk Railroad? Okay, a handful, all right. And they're on Capitol Records. They were doing okay, their music was okay, they were a rock band. And he conceived of the idea of taking a copy of the album cover and blowing it up to gigantic proportions and putting that on the side of a building in Times Square. And it got made all the news broadcasts, and everybody in New York, and because of the news broadcasts throughout the country, heard of Grand Funk Railroad and were very interested in seeing what this band was all about. And they broke wide open because of this huge poster was on the side of a building in Times Square. It went up about 18 stories. It was just ridiculous. And then there was a manager who managed an artist named Richard Marx. And he came up with an idea. If he started on the East Coast, because of the time differential, he could go to about 6 airports at major cities across the country. And so hired a private jet, and Richard Marx went to airports, went into the airport, set up shop, and did about a 20-minute set at 6 airports all the way across country. Again, it was newsworthy. He had a small reputation at the time. It happened to be a good album, and it called attention. The public's attention was called to the album, and he became a fairly good soft rock star. And then there was a young woman named Tiffany. Who here has heard of Tiffany? Okay, congratulations. And Tiffany, manager, decided that she was going to do a mall tour. Went to about 25 miles across country for free. Richard Marx concerts were for free as well. And she played before tens of thousands of young people in these 20 or 25 malls. And she had a pop hit, and she lasted. She was a big artist for a couple of years, didn't have sustaining power. But that's the kind of thing that makes, in my opinion, a great manager, someone who comes up with that one big idea that's going to break his or her artist.
Okay, great. So would you say that you don't necessarily have to be an attorney to be a good manager?
No, not at all.
Do you find most people have both?
Yes.
And when you as an attorney are dealing with managers, is there ever any friction there with, how you feel things should be run and how the manager?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. I'm going to move on to another group that you represented for a bit, the Doors.
Yes.
Can you talk about what it was like to work with the Doors?
Well, it was interesting. It was a short representation because of the fact that I was recommended to the Doors by their manager. And I met with them a number of times, and I negotiated their first contract with Elektra Records. But after about a year, they had unhappy differences with their manager, and it was heading toward litigation. And because the ethics of the profession require that you not have a conflict of interest, I had to step away from both acts. So I represented the Doors for a year, had 4 or 5 meetings with them. All 4 of the Doors were there. Most of my discussions took place with Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek. They were the business people. Jim Morrison seemed almost detached, but he listened and took everything in, never really said very much. but it was an interesting experience.
Last week, we celebrated the 50-year anniversary of when the Beatles were on American Bandstand.
Yeah.
And
The Ed Sullivan Show.
The Ed Sullivan Show.
That's all right.
Sorry, this
That's
shows my
okay.
age.
Yeah.
So the Doors also went on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there's a rumor, and I want to know if you know if it's true, that they were told specifically not to sing certain lyrics, and then they sang them anyway, and that was supposed to be very controversial. Do you know anything about this?
I do not.
Okay. Well, then I'll move on. I'm going to go on now to another one of your very well-known clients, T-Bone Burnett. Mm-hmm. Everyone here may have seen him. He performed at the Grammys last year, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, T-Bone Burnett was an artist. He was on what was then called Columbia Records, and very, very intelligent guy. And as an example of his intelligence, his first album title was called Truth Decay, which impressed me. I can hear that everybody else here is extremely impressed by that as well. But he became a producer. He produced a young woman who would become a contemporary Christian, very popular artist named Leslie Phillips. She changed her name to Sam Phillips, became a pop artist, and was produced by T-Bone Burnett. She was on Virgin Records. They had tremendous amount of faith in her. Did four albums, even though none of them sold. But Leslie got something out of it. She married T-Bone Burnett, and but she didn't get that much out of it because they're no longer married. But T-Bone went on to produce many other artists. He had his own band. He played guitar, and he was asked to produce a soundtrack of a film called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And he also produced the soundtrack album of that movie, and he won 5 Grammys for producing that album. Has gone on to win subsequent Grammys, has done many additional soundtracks, and is really a hot property these days.
Do you still work with him?
No.
Okay.
No.
Did you work on any of the licensing for soundtracks that he
No.
made music for?
No.
Okay.
I worked on his recording contracts and his production contracts.
Okay. So because I said the Titanic, I want you guys to, another client that Al represented was Will Jennings, and I'm going to list off the correct things that he actually was involved with. Higher Love, which is a Steve Winwood song. Tears in Heaven by Eric Clapton. Looks Like We Made It, Barry Manilow. My Heart Will Go On, Celine Dion. So he wrote all of those songs.
The lyrics for all
The
of
lyrics.
those songs, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so were you involved with helping him with publishing rights with those? Or
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Early in his career, he had to assign his publishing rights to existing publishers. The time came when he was able to co-publish with his publisher, and I negotiated those deals. The time came when he was able to own his own publishing outright, and he had an administration deal with a publishing company, the publishing affiliate of A&M Records. I negotiated that. I negotiated his deal where he maintained 25% of the publishing on My Heart Will Go On, which was the theme from the Titanic. And that was an interesting negotiation because of the fact that there were 4 people well, more than that. Paramount Pictures had the rights in the United States. 20th Century Fox had the rights to the film outside the United States. Famous Music was Paramount Pictures music publishing affiliate, and Fox Music was a Fox 20th Century Fox Pictures affiliate, and then he wrote the song with James Horner, who wrote the score for the entire Titanic. So there were a lot of people involved, and Paramount used their initial attorney, their film and video attorney, and after trying with 4 other attorneys to negotiate that contract, we sort of threw up our hands because the film and television attorney was the wrong person for Paramount to use, because film and television attorneys can't negotiate music contracts and vice versa. So finally everybody had music attorneys. The picture came out, and I was in Italy at the time, in a city called Siena, and I wanted to go to the movies one night, and they had 2 theaters in town, and they were both showing the Titanic, and it alerted me to the fact that this might be a worthwhile picture. But I was still negotiating the contract at the time. The negotiations went on for about a year and a half after the Titanic was no longer in major distribution as a film. But the attorneys were all mature people, and we managed to hammer out an agreement. But the full negotiation took about 2.5 years because of the multiple parties involved.
Wow. Do you know which performance right organization Steve Winwood is, or not Steve Winwood, Jennings is with?
Yes, he's with BMI. He's been with BMI from the inception of his career until the present. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a preference, for people out there who are songwriters, or any recommendation of a performance right organization that they should go with depending on their place?
Not really. Both BMI and ASCAP. There's a third one called CSAC, which is quite small. But between BMI and ASCAP, they're both very good. They're both excellent. If you join and become a member of ASCAP or an affiliate of BMI, no one's ever going to be able to say to you, what a disaster, they're terrible. They're both excellent. They both do good work. They're different. ASCAP is a membership society. It is owned, operated, and run by a board of ASCAP publisher members and ASCAP songwriter members. And so it's a membership organization. BMI is a private organization, and it is owned by primarily radio station owners, and it's to BMI's credit, and actually to the owners of BMI, that BMI does negotiate very hard on behalf of its publisher and writer affiliates against some of the owners of its public performance rights organization. But they're both very, very good. I have found that over the years, BMI has better public relations. The payout of performance royalties is both the same, or relatively the same. They both license every user of music throughout the country. Nobody really who's in the performance business, radio and television stations primarily, but also hotels and skating rinks and supermarkets. They all have to have licenses with both ASCAP and BMI, so that's not a handicap to either of them. So they're both very, very, very good.
Okay. I want to move on to your involvement with the Grammys.
Okay.
Okay. Can you tell everyone here how many Grammy Award ceremonies you've been to?
56.
And does anyone here know how many Grammy Award ceremonies there have been? 56. Is there anyone else that can say that they've been to all 56 award shows?
I'm not sure. Nobody here. Nobody's old enough. But probably not. I think that there have been a number who have been to 20 or 25 Grammy shows, but it seems that unless you're actively engaged in the business, you somehow lose your interest in business. Music business matters. So I think 20 or 25 might be the maximum.
Okay. So when you first went, the very first Grammy Award ceremony, who were the big artists that year?
Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, the Anita Kerr Singers, Teresa Brewer, Dinah Shore, Doris Day, Eddie Fisher, Tony Martin, Perry Como, and others too numerous to mention.
Okay. And so how have you seen the Grammys change from when it first started to just this year?
Well, when the Grammys first came into being, it had a relatively small membership. The first show was at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. About 200 attendees. There were a total of 16 categories, all pop, no other form of music whatsoever. But basically, except for certain groups being very, very familiar with different kinds of music, the population at large only had pop music to listen to, really. So the awards were all for pop. It moved after about 3 or 4 years into a venue of about 5,000 people when it started to get a little bit more membership, and they felt they were ready, so they moved to the Hollywood Palladium, which was in the heart of Hollywood. And then a number of years later, and that venue held 5,000 people. A number of years later, they moved to the Shrine Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles, which held 6,000 people. When they were at the Palladium, they couldn't fill it with 5,000 people. When they were at the Shrine Auditorium, I had a couple of youngsters who were in their early teens, and I wanted to take them to the show, so I asked the executive director if it was okay, and she says, please, we can use all the bodies we can get. And the show wasn't very popular. The Grammy Awards did have a television on the ABC network, which came on television a month after the show. They filmed the winners in a recording studio, and they put on about 10 or 12 performances after the fact of no audience or anything of that kind, just the artists who performed at the Grammys singing for a television show. It was many years later that a gentleman who had been an agent and then a manager and then became involved in television, wanted to expand his horizons in television, and he entered into an agreement with the Grammy organization for an option to have the Grammys on live, on network. And he tried, his contract was for a year. He tried, within the 3 networks without success, but he kept trying. He tried one wrinkle after another, and he offered all kinds of incentives. Nobody would take it. And then the year was nearly up, and if I might digress a little bit, he was in New York, where CBS was located, and a fellow named John Woods was president of CBS at the time, and Pierre was a good friend of his, and he visited him in New York. He says, okay, you've got to take my show. I'm going to lose the rights to be able to be the executive producer of the show unless you take it. And he absolutely refused. And Pierre was going to come back. It was a Friday, and he went to the Bloomingdale's store in New York, the famous Bloomingdale's, and he ran into John Wood's wife. And she said, Pierre, well, what are you doing here? He says, well, I'm here to sell your show, and I had a meeting with your blankety-blank husband, and I couldn't get him to take the show. And she said, oh, that's a shame. That's too bad. And she says, but what are you doing over the weekend? He says, well, I'm going back tonight. She says, no, you're not. You're coming out to our place in Long Island for the weekend. And Pierre thought very quickly, okay. And the first night that he was at their home, he left his room to go to the lavatory, and he passed another bedroom, and he saw the door was slightly ajar. He looked in, and it was the bedroom of John Woods and his wife. And so Pierre, being a very different kind of guy, Mr. Showbiz, a jovial kind of guy, always had some good ideas, went into the room. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and he jumped into bed in between John Woods and his wife. And they both woke with a start. What are you doing here? He said, I'm not moving until you take my damn show. And John Woods said, okay, I'm going to take your show. And the show has been on CBS for live television for close to 30 years, I think it is now. And of course, it's been very lucrative for CBS. They still had, they couldn't fill, they had trouble filling the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. And so that Pierre wanted to take it to New York, and it was at the Radio City Music Hall. They had trouble filling that too. And one fine day after the show had been on the air, CBS was debating whether or not they would want to get first crack at renegotiating for the next 5 years. Billboard magazine, which was then and still is the Bible of the music industry, had an article, a feature article on page 1 as to the artists who either performed on the Grammys or who won Grammys, had huge spikes in their record sales. One artist went from a sale of 20,000 albums up to something like 150,000 albums in a period of 2 weeks after appearing on the show and winning a Grammy. And that was indicative of virtually everybody who was on the Grammy show. And all of a sudden, the Grammy show became a hot ticket. You couldn't get tickets for love of money. And instead of welcoming anybody, the general public, anybody who would, be a body who would fill a seat in the theater, they stopped selling tickets to anybody except members, and they allowed a limited number of guests that the members could have. And then Pierre, after years of lobbying, got the show to a venue, an arena. And for the last 10, 15 years, it's been at either the Staples Arena in Los Angeles or the Madison Square Garden in New York. And again, it's the hottest ticket in town. You just can't get a ticket to the Grammy. And as I say, it's very successful. This year, in the TV ratings, it had a 48 rating, which was more than double the closest show. And so it's a very, very big show. And there are parties, Grammy parties all over the country. And I'm aware of the fact that Full Sail had a Grammy party. I don't know how many of you here attended, but I hear it was quite quite a success. And it's a great organization. But it's more than the Grammy show, if I might.
Please.
It has a charitable arm called Music Cares, and Music Cares assists people who are part of the creative community in the business, songwriters, producers, engineers, artists, background singers, background musicians, album notes writers, any of those who are down on their luck and can't make their health premium or their car payment or loses their job, get financial assistance. And they also help them with counseling. And they, for instance, at the Grammys, Music Cares has a what they call the safe harbor room. Unfortunately, there are still those in the business who have alcohol and substance abuse problems, and they go into the safe harbor room with social workers who manage to talk to them and discuss their problems with them and that sort of thing, help them get through the show. And it's a great organization. There's also a Grammy Foundation, which is educational. They give scholarships. They have programs for getting instruments into the school. They propagandize at every turn they get to try and get music back in the schools. And that's a wonderful organization too. And they do a lot of good in the community as well. It's just a wonderful, wonderful organization. And there are 15,000 voting members now. In order to be a voting member, you've had to have 6 masters in national distribution. You can't have 6 combine having written 2 songs, produced 2 records, engineered 2 records. You have to have 6 of any one of those categories that I met of people who I mentioned, and you can become a voting member. But they have a very, very large associate members, and that is for anybody who is working in the business and can demonstrate that they are actively working in the music business. They can become an associate member. And they have all the privileges of membership, except for the fact that they cannot vote for the Grammys. And they will usually give the voting members a couple of weeks head start as far as sending out invitations to the Grammy show. But associate members are able to attend the Grammy show as well. And as I say, it's a great organization.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's your involvement with Music Cares that was the reason that in 2006 you were awarded the Grammy Foundation's Entertainment Law Initiative Award, which is awarded to recognizes attorneys who have demonstrated a commitment to advancing and supporting the music community through service.
In part, I did a lot of organization work,
Okay.
but largely for that, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And part of your involvement with the Grammys is that you were the president of the National Association of Record Artists. So can you explain, okay, that organization puts on the Grammys.
Right.
What do you do as the president? What do you get to just make all of the decisions about how the show is going to run and who's going to be on?
No. The president makes all the final decisions as to, or this is when I was president, as to whenever there's a dispute, who's eligible for a Grammy, who's not eligible for a Grammy, and disputes over tickets and things of that kind, and whether there's going to be a program, an initiative or not, a deal with sponsors, a deal in the negotiations with the executive director and who hires the director, the line producer, the sound, the visuals, and then is the chairman of the television committee. And it's a television committee that makes all the decisions to this day as to who's going to be on the show and what they're going to be able to perform. There's a requirement, unless it's a special segment, that the only songs that the artists can perform on the Grammys are those songs for which they're nominated. They cannot perform their latest single, for instance. But if they had a Grammy nominated song that's in the final 5, they have to perform that song on the Grammys. The only leeway the artist would have would be if they're nominated for the best album, because they might have 10 or 12 songs to choose from. It has to be approved by the television committee primarily, so that there's a good balance between up-tempo and ballads and things of that kind. But it's, when I was president, I spent 3 mornings a week with the executive director, who had letters about that high, and as to various problems and things that they wanted from the Academy, or they wanted the Academy to do, and that sort of thing. And I would say yay or nay and that sort of thing. Spent a lot of time doing that. And by the way, there's someone beside me who comes and lectures at the Grammys, who was a very famous engineer who'll go nameless, and somebody who assisted him with the Thriller album, who wanted to be included as having the right to share that Grammy and get a Grammy, as well as the primary engineer. And I was handed that dispute and had to make the difficult decision, deciding that only the principal engineer was entitled to receive the Grammy. But that's typical of something that, would be done.
Okay. This is you at the Grammys in 1988. Mm-hmm. Can you tell everybody who performed right before you went on?
Yes. I went on immediately after Michael Jackson and had an 8-minute performance, primarily of the song
Man in the Mirror.
The Man in the Mirror. And I gave a little talk primarily about censorship, because there were a lot of efforts to censor records at the time. And I also gave a President's Award to Vladimir Horowitz, a classical pianist who opened up Russia as a venue, a country where American artists could come over there and perform. How many people here know the name Vladimir Horowitz? Oh, okay, very good. All right, fine. A preeminent classical music pianist, classical pianist in the 20th century, one of only 3 or 4. Great artist. Do we have time for me to tell a little anecdote?
I would love for you. I was going to ask you about, the one that you're going to tell.
Well, I was president at the time. The show was in Radio City Music Hall. Michael Jackson was about to go on, and anybody who was going to appear on the show for any reason had somebody from the Grammy organization assigned to them to just follow them around and sort of do their bidding if they had any questions or any problems with the show itself. Just as Michael Jackson's about to come on, the gentleman who was following Vladimir Horowitz was at my knees. I was in the first row, of course. And he said, Mr. Horowitz wants to see you backstage because he has a question for you. So I missed Michael Jackson, but I went backstage, and Vladimir Horowitz and his wife was there. She was the daughter of the great conductor Arturo Toscanini. But anyhow, he said, "What am I supposed to do?" And I said, "Well, I have a plaque, and I'm going to present to you." He said, "Then what do I do?" I said, "Well, you say something nice about the Grammys. You say how you've enjoyed your career, and any, a few memorable moments that you've had, and things of that." And I gave him 3 or 4 scenarios as to what he could say, in a minute or two, thereabouts. And okay, comes the time, Michael Jackson is through with his number, I'm introduced, I talk about censorship, and then I talk about Vladimir Horowitz, and they show a segment from 60 Minutes that Vladimir Horowitz was on, and then they introduce him, and out he comes, and I hand him his plaque. He comes up to the microphone and says, "Thank you," and off he walks.
And that's what caused you to miss Michael Jackson.
That's what caused me to miss Michael
Wonderful.
Jackson, yes.
Have you gotten to see Michael Jackson perform since then?
Yes, I have seen Michael Jackson, yes.
Good.
No, I haven't. Oh. I've seen the Jackson 5.
Oh,
yeah,
well, that's
yes,
even better.
yeah, but he was, of course, was the lead singer. Yeah,
pretty amazing.